She was the last one standing on the platform, and every person in that gilded hall had already decided she did not matter. Before we go any further into this extraordinary story, if you are watching this right now, we would love to know where in the world you are joining us from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, because our community stretches across every corner of this earth, and we find that remarkable. And if this kind of story moves you, if you believe that the people the world overlooks are often the ones most worth knowing, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale like this one. Now, let us return to that cold February evening in London, 1814, and to the girl no one wanted. The Hartwell Charity Gala had been, for 11 consecutive years, one of the most quietly controversial events in the whole of the English social calendar. It was never spoken of in drawing rooms with any great volume, never printed in the society pages with full transparency, and never acknowledged directly by the aristocratic families who attended it with such faithful regularity. And yet it endured, and it filled, and it functioned, because it served a purpose that wealth has always found convenient: the redistribution of inconvenient people into manageable arrangements. The women presented at the Hartwell Gala were not sold. The organizers were always careful to clarify. They were sponsored. They were daughters of ruined lords, nieces of bankrupt viscounts, cousins of men who had gambled away every stone of their ancestral homes. They were gentlewomen without prospects, offered to patrons of means who might take them on as wards, companions, or, in several notable cases over the years, wives. The language was always careful. The reality was considerably less so. This particular evening, the February air pressed cold and damp against the tall windows of Hartwell House, and inside, 12 young women had been presented to an audience of perhaps 40 men of consequence. Candles burned in their hundreds along the walls, casting everything in amber warmth that was flattering to the room and to most of the women who had passed through it. One by one, they had been chosen. A nod here, a quiet word to the event coordinator there, a gloved hand extended with the authority of a man who understood the value of acquisition. By 9:30, 11 of the 12 had been matched. Alara Voss remained. She stood on the low wooden platform at the far end of the hall with the particular stillness of someone who has long since made peace with being overlooked. She was not unattractive, precisely, but she was the kind of woman who required more than a passing glance to understand, and passing glances were all that most men in such rooms were ever willing to offer. Her dress was gray, not the fashionable silver gray that was then in season, but a practical, well-mended pewter that spoke of economy rather than taste. Her hair was dark and pinned with more efficiency than elegance. Her spectacles, small, wire-rimmed, slightly askew, sat on the bridge of a nose that was perhaps a fraction too strong for classical beauty. She had a book in her hands. She had brought it herself, tucked under her arm when she arrived, because she had been told the evening's proceedings might run long, and she had seen no reason to stand idle. The event coordinator had asked her, with barely concealed horror, to put it away when she first mounted the platform. Alara had complied. But now, with the hall thinning and her situation made plain, she had retrieved it from beneath her arm and opened it again, because there seemed little point in pretense. The remaining gentlemen in the room were speaking amongst themselves with the satisfied ease of men whose business had concluded. Nobody looked at the platform. Nobody looked at her. The event coordinator, a thin woman named Mrs. Pelham, moved toward Alara with the expression of someone approaching a small but irritating administrative problem. "Miss Voss," she said, low and brisk, "perhaps it would be best if we quietly arranged for you two. Good evening." The voice came from the back of the room. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. There was a quality to it, measured, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man accustomed to being heard without ever needing to raise his volume, that caused something close to silence to fall over the remaining occupants of the hall. The Duke of Ashford had been present all evening, though few had been certain of it. He had stood near the rear wall, half in shadow, speaking to no one, choosing nothing, attending, it had been assumed, purely as a matter of social obligation. He was 34 years old, and had been a widower for 3. He was also, by any reasonable accounting, the most powerful man in the room. His dukedom was old, his fortune older, and his reputation, cold, reclusive, unknowable, was the kind that caused people to step back slightly when he entered a space, as though the air around him required more careful navigation. He walked forward now, unhurried, his dark coat immaculate, his eyes fixed on the platform. Fixed, specifically, on Alara. She looked up from her book. He looked at her, not the sweeping, assessing look that the other men had given the women throughout the evening, cataloging appearance and deportment and potential social utility. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has surprised them. Quietly, directly, with an attention that felt, disconcertingly, like being actually perceived. "I will take this one," he said. Mrs. Pelham blinked. Around the room, conversations faltered. Alara closed her book. She did not look away from him. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Mrs. Pelham said carefully, "but Miss Voss is perhaps not quite." "I am aware of what she is," the Duke said. He had not looked away from Alara. "I said I will take her." No one in the room argued with the Duke of Ashford. They never did. And Alara Voss, who had spent an entire evening being rendered invisible, found herself suddenly, irrevocably seen, and had absolutely no idea what to make of it. The carriage that collected Alara from Hartwell House was the finest she had ever entered, and she spent the first several minutes of the journey acutely aware of how out of place her mended gloves looked against the dark velvet upholstery. The Duke sat across from her. He had said nothing since the hall. He said nothing now. He looked out of the window at the passing city with the expression of a man whose thoughts were entirely his own business, and Alara, who had survived 23 years largely by reading situations with precision, understood instinctively that this was not coldness, exactly. It was containment. There was a difference, though most people never bothered to look closely enough to find it. She looked out of her own window and said nothing either. It was, she would reflect later, probably the thing that saved the evening from becoming unbearable. They arrived not at a residence, but at a solicitor's office on a quiet street near Lincoln's Inn, lit from within, clearly arranged in advance, the solicitor himself waiting with papers already drawn. Alara stepped out of the carriage and looked at the building, then back at the Duke. "You planned this before the evening concluded," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, offered with the same even tone she might use to note a change in the weather. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "I planned for a contingency," he said. "Come inside. There is an arrangement I wish to discuss." The solicitor's name was Mr. Graves, and he had clearly been in the Duke's employ long enough to have mastered the art of facilitating unusual business without visible reaction. He gestured Alara to a chair, offered tea, which she accepted, and positioned himself behind his desk with professional neutrality while the Duke remained standing because, she would learn, he almost always remained standing. "I require a ward," the Duke said, without preamble. "Specifically, I require someone who will occupy that role publicly for the duration of the London season. Attend select events with my household. Be present at Ashford Manor when family visits occur. Conduct yourself with discretion." He paused. "I do not require companionship, conversation, or anything of a personal nature. I require a credible social arrangement." Alara wrapped both hands around her teacup. "You wish to silence pressure to remarry," she said. He looked at her steadily. "My family has grown persistent. A ward in residence serves as adequate redirection. It signals engagement with social responsibility without inviting matrimonial speculation. And in return?" Mr. Graves slid a document across the desk. Alara set down her tea and read it, properly, carefully from the beginning, which seemed to mildly surprise both men. The arrangement was precise. She would receive a modest but genuine annual allowance, full room and board at Ashford Manor, and a lump sum upon the conclusion of the season. Enough, she calculated rapidly, to cover 8 months of her brother Thomas's medical care, with a remainder that might allow her to resume her research without depending on borrowed laboratory space and borrowed pseudonyms. She turned the page. "There is a conduct clause," she noted. "There is." It prohibits any action that would draw public censure or embarrassment to the Ashford name. She looked up. That is a broad prohibition, Your Grace. I would need it defined more specifically before I could agree to it. Mr. Graves glanced at the Duke. The Duke looked at Alara with an expression she could not quite interpret. Not irritation, not amusement, but something that occupied the careful space between the two. Define it as you require, he said. She took the pen Mr. Graves offered and made 3 annotations in the margin, neat and small, in the handwriting of someone who had spent years producing work that needed to be legible under poor lighting. The Duke leaned forward slightly to read them without asking, which she noted. He straightened, then gave a single nod. Acceptable, he said. There is one further matter, Alara said. She set the pen down. I have a brother, Thomas. He is 17, and he is currently residing in a boarding situation in Cheapside that is inadequate for his condition. He has a weakness of the lungs. The arrangement you are offering would fund his care, but care alone is not sufficient. I need to know that if his situation worsens during the season, I will be permitted to attend to him without penalty to this contract. Silence. The fire in the grate ticked and settled. He would need to be relocated, the Duke said, and his tone had shifted, fractionally, but she heard it. Cheapside is no place for a lung condition. The air at the manor would be considerably more suitable. Alara stared at him. I am not in the habit of incomplete arrangements, he said, as though this were explanation enough. He looked at Mr. Graves. Add the brother. Supervised residence at the East Guest Wing. Medical attendance as required. Mr. Graves wrote. Alara said nothing for a moment. Not because she was overwhelmed. She was not a woman who was easily overwhelmed, but because she was recalibrating. The man across from her was not what the evening had suggested. Or rather, he was exactly what the evening had suggested, but the evening had suggested something more complex than the room had understood. Why me? She asked. It was the question she had been holding since the moment he had spoken in the hall. There were 11 other women. Several of them were well-mannered, presentable, and unencumbered by lung-sick brothers and margin annotations. The Duke picked up his gloves from the side table. He considered the question as though it deserved genuine thought. Because you brought a book, he said, finally. And when no one chose you, you opened it. He moved toward the door. The carriage will take you to collect your things tonight. We leave for the manor at first light. Alara looked down at the contract, her annotations, his acceptance, the additional clause about Thomas written in Mr. Graves' careful hand. She picked up the pen once more and signed her name. She had no way of knowing in that moment that she had just signed herself into the only place she had ever, in all her life, belong. Ashford Manor did not welcome visitors so much as it absorbed them, drew them through its iron gates and down its long gravel approach, and into a silence so complete that Alara found herself holding her breath as the carriage rolled to a stop before the great front doors, as though noise itself might be unwelcome here. It was early morning when they arrived, the sky a pale and watery gray, frost still clinging to the formal hedgerows that lined the approach. The house was enormous in the way that old things are enormous, not merely in physical dimension but in presence, in accumulated weight. It had stood for 200 years, and it looked it, not from neglect but from the particular gravity of a place that had witnessed too much and forgotten none of it. Thomas was asleep in the opposite corner of the carriage, wrapped in a blanket the Duke's staff had provided without being asked, a detail Alara had noted and filed carefully alongside several others that did not fit the reputation she had been given the previous evening. Her brother had said very little when she arrived at his Cheapside lodgings in the small hours to collect him, because Thomas was 17 and clever and understood. When his sister appeared at midnight with a signed contract and a ducal carriage, that questions were better saved for morning. He had simply gathered his things and gone with her, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. Now she stepped out onto the gravel and looked up at the manor. Every window on the upper floors was dark. The ground floor showed light only where the staff had clearly lit lamps in anticipation of the Duke's return. The entrance hall, a corridor to the left, what she guessed might be a kitchen passage at the far end of the east wing. The rest of the house sat in shadow. The Duke descended from the carriage behind her and moved toward the doors without pausing to observe the house, because a man does not observe what he has long since stopped seeing. Inside, the entrance hall was grand and cold. A housekeeper named Mrs. Dallow met them, a composed woman of 50 with steady eyes and the bearing of someone who had managed difficult households before and found the experience instructive. She welcomed Alara with correct politeness, directed 2 footmen toward the matter of Thomas and the luggage, and began a brief orientation of the relevant ground floor rooms. Alara listened. She also looked. The entrance hall had high ceilings and good bones, a sweeping staircase, a black and white tiled floor, cornicing that spoke of genuine craftsmanship. But the walls told a different story. There were shapes on them, lighter patches in the paint, rectangular and oval and square, where frames had hung and been removed. Not recently. The paint had settled into itself around those absences, which meant the pictures had been taken down years ago. And at the far end of the hall, where the staircase turned on its landing, a large portrait remained, but it faced the wall. She could see the back of the frame, plain wood, pointing out at the room like a closed door. She said nothing about it. In the days that followed, she found more. A music room on the 2nd floor, locked. A conservatory along the south-facing corridor, its glass clouded with disuse, the plants within long dead, their dried remains still in their terracotta pots, as though someone had simply walked out one afternoon and never returned to water them. A sitting room near the library that had been furnished with evident care and then systematically stripped, the walls bare, the mantelpiece empty, the curtains a different fabric from the windows, too short by several inches, clearly replacements for something that had been removed. The house had been unmade, deliberately, in pieces. Alara began, quietly, to make it again. It started without decision, almost accidentally. On her 3rd morning, passing through the entrance hall, she paused at the portrait on the landing and turned it to face the room. It was a landscape, a Suffolk coastline, gray-green water and wide sky. Nothing personal, nothing controversial. Just a painting of the sea that had been made to face a wall for no reason she could identify. A footman saw her do it. He said nothing. By evening, the painting was facing the wall again. The following morning, she turned it around again. She said nothing about it to anyone. It remained facing the room. She moved through the house in that manner, unhurried, unannounced, making small adjustments with the confidence of someone who understood that a house in this state of deliberate blankness had not been arranged by indifference. It had been arranged by pain. And pain, in her experience, was not best addressed by confrontation. It was best addressed by the slow, patient introduction of light. She asked Mrs. Dallow if the conservatory might be cleared and, eventually, replanted. Mrs. Dallow hesitated, then said she would inquire with His Grace. His Grace sent no reply, which Alara decided to interpret as the absence of refusal. She began clearing the conservatory on a Tuesday. She was on her knees pulling dead root systems from a large ceramic planter on Thursday afternoon when she became aware that she was no longer alone. She looked up. The Duke stood in the doorway, his coat on, as though he had just come in from outside, his expression doing the complicated thing it sometimes did where several emotions occupied it simultaneously and canceled each other into apparent neutrality. He looked at the cleared space, at the neat pile of salvaged pots, at her dirt-covered gloves. The gardener, he said, is available to assist with this. I know, Alara said. I prefer to do the initial assessment myself. It tells you more about what went wrong. A pause. And what has gone wrong? He asked, and his voice was careful in a way that suggested he was not, entirely, asking about the conservatory. Alara sat back on her heels and regarded him with the same directness she gave everything. Neglect, she said. Not cruelty. Just an absence of attention, sustained long enough to do real damage. She looked around the space. The structure is sound. It can be restored. The Duke said nothing. But he did not leave. He stood in the doorway of the conservatory for another few minutes, watching her work, and then he walked away, and Alara turned back to the soil and allowed herself, very quietly, to wonder about him. The library at Ashford Manor was the one room in the house that had not been unmade. Alara discovered this on her 5th day, pushing open a heavy oak door at the end of the east corridor and stepping into a space that stopped her entirely, Not from grandeur, though it was grand, but from the sensation of walking into the only room in a grieving house that had been permitted to remain itself. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, books arranged with the particular logic of someone who had genuinely used them rather than merely acquired them. A long reading table ran down the center, its surface scarred with ink and use. 2 armchairs sat before a fireplace that showed evidence of recent occupation, a folded newspaper, a glass not yet cleared away. She understood immediately that this was where the Duke lived, in the truest sense. The rest of the manor was a shell he moved through. This room he inhabited. She hesitated in the doorway, weighing the intrusion. Then she looked at the shelves and stepped inside, because she was, at her core, constitutionally incapable of leaving a library unexplored. She was careful. She did not disturb the reading table or the armchairs, or anything that bore the particular arrangement of personal use. She moved along the shelves slowly, reading spines, natural philosophy, classical history, land surveying, estate law, a long run of agricultural journals from the previous decade, botany. She paused at the botany. The volumes here were not decorative. They were working books, annotated, marked with slips of paper, their spines creased from repeated opening. She drew one out carefully and turned to a marked page. The annotation in the margin was not the Duke's hand. She had seen his signature on the contract, bold and angular. This writing was smaller, more rapid, the kind produced by someone whose thoughts moved faster than the pen. A woman's hand, she thought, though she could not have said precisely why. She replaced the volume and moved further along. The false panel announced itself to her almost reluctantly. She would not have found it at all had she not been the kind of person who notices when a shelf's depth is inconsistent with the wall behind it. She pressed the wood at the seam and felt the give before she heard the soft click, and then a section of shelving swung inward perhaps 3 inches on a hidden hinge, and Alara stood very still for a moment with her hand against the wood. She thought about closing it. She genuinely considered it. She opened it instead. The space behind was narrow, a deep alcove, perhaps 4 feet wide, with a low shelf running its length. On the shelf, a wooden box, a rolled series of architectural drawings bound with cord, a leather-bound journal, and 3 specimen cases of the kind used by field naturalists, each containing pressed botanical samples mounted on paper with careful handwritten labels. Alara crouched before the specimen cases first, because she was a scientist before she was anything else, and her hands moved with the practiced care of someone accustomed to handling fragile preserved materials. The samples were exceptional, detailed, precisely mounted, the labels recording location, date of collection, and common name alongside the Latin classification. The handwriting was the same rapid, compressed script she had seen in the botanical volumes on the shelf. She examined the dates on the labels. The earliest was 1806. The most recent was 1811. She sat back slowly. The late Duchess of Ashford had died in the autumn of 1811. That much was known. It had been in the papers, though the accounts had been brief and notably short on detail. A sudden illness. Deeply mourned. The Duke had retreated from society immediately afterward and had not substantially re-emerged. But the samples in this case were dated through October of 1811, the latest only weeks before the reported date of death. A woman in decline from sudden illness did not spend her final weeks pressing botanical specimens in the field. Alara opened the journal. She was not proud of it. She had a strong and genuine belief in the privacy of personal writing, cultivated partly from principle and partly from years of keeping her own notebooks under lock and key in lodgings where privacy was not guaranteed. But she was also a scientist, and the evidence before her did not cohere, and incoherent evidence demanded examination. The journal was not a diary. It was a working record, observations, measurements, sketches of plant structures, cross-references to published papers. Professional documentation, the kind she herself produced, though considerably more accomplished in its botanical illustration than anything she could manage. There were notes toward what appeared to be a longer written work, phrases like "see argument in Chapter 4," and "this contradicts Whitmore's classification," which I will address in the introduction. The woman had been writing a book. Alara turned to the architectural drawings and untied the cord with careful fingers. They unrolled to reveal plans, not of Ashford Manor, but of a greenhouse structure, considerably larger than the conservatory, with annotations detailing orientation for light, soil drainage systems, temperature management for non-native specimens. Ambitious, technically sophisticated plans, drawn by someone who understood both the science and the construction requirements. And then she found, tucked inside the rolled drawings, a letter. It was brief, undated, unaddressed, written in the same compressed hand as the journal. Asterisk, the work is nearly complete. I am sorry for what must come next. I know you will not understand it now. Perhaps you never will. But the work must survive, and I cannot ensure that it does if I remain. Please keep it safe. That is all I ask of you now, asterisk. Alara read it twice. Then she sat on the floor of the alcove, which was undignified, but the situation seemed to warrant it, and held the letter and thought very carefully. The Duke's wife had not died in sudden illness. Or, if she had, it had not happened in the way it had been presented. This letter was a farewell of a particular kind, deliberate, premeditated, apologetic. She had left. She had chosen to leave, for reasons connected to work she believed would not survive her presence. And the Duke had told the world she was dead. The question was why? And the further question, the one that sat behind the first and complicated it considerably, was whose protection that story had been constructed to serve. She was still sitting on the library floor, the letter in her hands, when she heard the door open. She looked up. The Duke stood in the entrance to the library. His eyes moved from her face to the open panel behind her, to the specimen cases, to the drawings, to the letter. Something happened in his expression that she had no name for, a kind of controlled collapse, a thing that moved through him and was suppressed before it could fully surface, leaving only a very particular stillness behind. He said nothing. Alara said nothing either. They looked at each other across the long room in the late afternoon light, and the silence between them was the most honest thing that had yet passed between two people who had not, until this moment, been honest with each other at all. He did not ask her what she had read. She did not offer to explain. Instead, the Duke crossed the library with the measured pace of a man who has decided something, pulled the second armchair slightly away from the fire and toward the center of the room, an adjustment of perhaps 18 inches, and sat down in it. He looked at the open panel for a moment, then at the specimen cases, then at nothing in particular. Alara rose from the floor with as much dignity as the situation afforded, replaced the letter with the drawings, and closed the panel. She did not latch it. She simply pressed it shut, and then sat in the other armchair and waited. Outside the library windows, the afternoon was moving toward dusk. The light came in low and amber, the way it does in February, when the sun has no great ambition. "The dinner is on Friday," he said finally. He was not, she understood, changing the subject. He was choosing where to begin. "My cousin Lord Hensley and his wife will attend. My aunt Lady Gresham. 2 families from the neighboring estates. 12 guests in total." He paused. "It will be the first formal dinner at the manor in 3 years. And you need me present," Alara said. "I need the arrangement visible and credible." He looked at her steadily. Lady Gresham is not uncritical in her observations. If she finds the arrangement unconvincing, she will say so, at length, to a considerable number of people. Alara nodded once. "I understand. There are things you should know before Friday," he said, and his voice dropped fractionally in register, not in volume but in something beneath volume, in the quality of what it carried. "About what is known, and what is said." "You may tell me what you choose," she said. "You are not obliged to explain anything." He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued over the past 5 days, the one that suggested she had said something he had not anticipated, and that the unanticipated thing had landed somewhere it was not entirely comfortable to receive. "Lady Gresham will ask you about your family," he said. "She will do it pleasantly, and mean it as a weapon. She does not approve of the ward arrangement, and she will attempt to expose it as insufficient within the first hour. You should be prepared for questions that feel social but function as interrogation." I grew up in a house where every dinner conversation was an interrogation of some kind, Alara said. My father was not a gentleman. I learned to navigate it. Something in him acknowledged this without comment. The other guests will follow Lady Gresham's lead, at least initially. If she accepts you, they will accept you. If she does not, then I will need to be more interesting to her than her skepticism, Alara said. I can manage that. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required, and then he said, You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more easily managed, he said, with what she was beginning to identify as his version of dry candor, almost entirely without inflection, offered with a faint implication that he found this more amusing than he intended to. I did annotate your contract in the margins, she said. That was a fairly legible indication. The almost expression. The almost smile. Friday arrived with gray skies and a wind that rattled the manor's older window frames and sent the fire in the drawing room guttering sideways at irregular intervals. The guests arrived in sequence throughout the afternoon, Lord Hensley and his wife Caroline first, then the neighboring families, then, last and most deliberately, Lady Gresham. She was 71 years old and had the posture of a woman who regarded the passage of time as a personal imposition. She was escorted in by her companion, surveyed the entrance hall with the particular attention of someone checking for changes, and fixed her gaze on Alara with an intelligence that was not remotely disguised by the social pleasantry of her expression. So this is the ward, she said, to the Duke, though her eyes remained on Alara. Miss Alara Voss, the Duke said. Lady Gresham. Voss, the old woman repeated. Your father was Edmund Voss? The botanist. Alara's composure did not shift, though something inside it tightened. He was. You knew him? Of him. Lady Gresham looked at her with recalibrated interest. He presented a paper to the Linnean Society in 1798 that caused considerable debate, largely because he was right and several established men found it inconvenient. A pause. You have his eyes. Not his manner, I think. No, Alara agreed. Not his manner. At dinner, the table was arranged with a formal precision that the manor staff had clearly not been required to produce in some years, but had managed nonetheless with admirable composure. Alara sat to the Duke's left, Lady Gresham to his right, which she understood was deliberate placement, close enough for observation, separated enough for the illusion of coincidence. The conversation was exactly as the Duke had described it, pleasant on the surface, purposeful beneath. Lord Hensley made several remarks that were clearly designed to establish the parameters of the arrangement and find them insufficient. His wife Caroline asked Alara, with great sweetness, what her expectations for the season were, a question whose subtext was loud enough to be heard from across the table. Alara answered everything with the particular quality of attention she brought to all things, direct, unhurried, precise, without being cold. She did not perform warmth she did not feel, but she did not withhold the warmth she did feel, and there was more of it than people generally expected to find in her, because people rarely expected much from her at all. It was midway through the third course that it happened. Lord Hensley, emboldened by 2 glasses of wine and the apparent safety of a crowded table, made a remark, low but audible, directed at the man to his left, about the Duke's evident new preference for plain arrangements over his previous rather more refined choices. The table did not quite go silent, but it thinned. Conversations dropped in volume in the involuntary way they do when something is said that requires a response and no one is certain who will give it. Alara reached for her water glass. She was deciding how to respond, not defensively. She never responded defensively, but with the kind of precision that might close the remark permanently, when the Duke spoke. Hensley. His voice was entirely even. He did not look up from his plate. You were saying, I believe, something about the eastern drainage difficulties on your property. I would be glad to have my land surveyor consult on it. Though perhaps a man with that particular problem ought to be more careful about drawing attention to things that fall short of adequate. The silence that followed was brief and absolute. Lord Hensley said nothing. He returned his attention to his plate with the expression of a man who has overstepped and knows it precisely. Alara set her water glass down. She did not look at the Duke. But she was aware of him in the way that she had been increasingly, inexplicably aware of him since the conservatory, since the library, since every moment in which he had done something that did not match what she had been told to expect of him. After dinner, when the guests had dispersed to the drawing room and the Duke stood near the far window with a glass he was not drinking, Alara crossed the room and stood beside him. She did not thank him. She understood instinctively that thanks would embarrass them both. "Your land surveyor," she said quietly. "Does he actually handle drainage consultations?" "Frequently," the Duke said. "And Lord Hensley?" "Has a chronic problem with his eastern fields that he is too proud to address properly." Alara looked out of the window at the dark garden beyond the glass. "That was neatly done," she said. "It was accurate," he said. "There is a difference." She turned to look at him then, directly, as was her habit, and found that he was already looking at her. Not glancing. Looking. With the same quality of attention he had brought to the platform at Hartwell House, that unnerving sense of being genuinely, completely perceived. She held his gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than any of the other moments between them had lasted. Then Lady Gresham appeared at her elbow, and the moment concluded. "Miss Voss," the old woman said, with something in her voice that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. "I should like to call on you next week, if that is agreeable. I knew your father's work. I suspect I should like to know yours." Alara looked at her steadily. "I would be glad of it," she said. Across the room, she did not look at the Duke. But she was aware, with a precision that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with something considerably less manageable, that he was smiling. The letter from the Royal Botanical Correspondence Society arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to a Mr. E. Voss, and was delivered to Alara by the Manor's butler with the carefully composed expression of a man who had learned not to remark upon the unusual. She took it upstairs, closed her door, and sat on the edge of the bed with it in her hands for a long moment before she opened it. It was not good news. It was, in the particular language of academic institutions communicating rejection, exquisitely bad news, written in the courteous, circuitous style of men who had spent considerable time constructing sentences that said your work is valueless without ever deploying those precise words. The correspondent, a Dr. Ambrose Whitmore, regretted that the Society was unable to accept Mr. Voss's proposed contribution to their forthcoming publication on native medicinal flora, as the methodology, while not without its merits, fell outside the current editorial direction of the journal. She had read similar letters before. She had a collection of them, stored in a folder in the bottom of her traveling case, which she kept not from masochism but from the scientific habit of maintaining complete records. This one joined the others in her mind with the flat, familiar weight of a thing that hurts less than it used to, but has not stopped hurting entirely. The name on the letter was the same name she had seen in the annotated margins of the botanical volumes in the library. Whitmore. This contradicts Whitmore's classification, which I will address in the introduction. The late Duchess's handwriting, rapid and certain. Alara sat with this coincidence, if it was a coincidence, and turned it carefully in her mind. She had begun publishing under E. Voss at the age of 19, when it had become clear that the work she was producing would not be received on its merits if received under the name of a woman. Her father had been a genuine botanist, trained and recognized, and the name carried enough residual weight in certain circles to open doors that would otherwise have remained shut. She had written to societies, submitted observations, contributed to 3 minor publications, and one that was, she allowed herself to believe, not minor at all, a paper on the adaptive root systems of chalk downland species that had been cited twice in subsequent work, both times without acknowledgement of the debt. She had never told anyone, not Thomas, who suspected but had the grace not to press. Not Mrs. Pelham at Hartwell House, who had processed her as a fallen gentleman's daughter with no particular qualifications. Not the Duke of Ashford, who had taken her on as a social arrangement and had not inquired further into what she was. She thought about the specimen cases in the library alcove, the press plants, carefully labeled, the journal with its working notes toward a book that had never been completed, the letter tucked inside the drawings. The work must survive. She had been trained to make connections from evidence, and the connections forming now were not comfortable. The following morning, She returned to the library early, before the house was fully awake, and opened the panel again. She took out the specimen cases and carried them to the reading table and set them beside her own working notebooks, which she had brought down from her room in the kind of decision that is not quite a decision but a recognition of inevitability. She worked for 2 hours before she heard the door. She did not close anything. She did not rearrange the table. She looked up as the Duke entered, registered his expression as he took in the open panel, the specimen cases, her notebooks spread alongside them, and met his gaze with the directness she brought to everything. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "I have been working up to it." He crossed the room and stood at the opposite side of the reading table. He looked at the materials laid out upon it, her notebooks, the Duchess's specimens, arranged side by side with the visual coherence of things that belong in proximity. His expression was that complicated controlled thing, but beneath it she could see, this morning, something that looked like apprehension. "Then give it," he said. She told him. She told him about Evos, about the first letter sent at 19, the careful construction of a professional identity that was genuinely her own and genuinely concealed, the years of work produced under conditions that would have been considerably easier if she had been born into a different body or a different century. She told him about the paper on chalk downland root systems and the uncredited citations. She told him about Dr. Whitmore's rejection letter, arrived yesterday, and the name she had seen in his wife's journal. She told him, finally, about what she had found when she compared the specimen labels in the alcove cases with her own field records, because she had, that morning, made a comparison that she had not been able to set aside from the moment she understood it. "Your wife was collecting in the same locations I have been working," she said. "Not the same years. She was there earlier, I was there after. But the same chalk downlands. The same specific sites." She placed her hand flat on her notebook, then on the specimen case. "The plants she documented, several of them are the same species I wrote about in my 1812 paper. But her observations predate mine by 3 years. Her methodology is better than mine was in 1812. Considerably better." She looked at him squarely. "She was not a hobbyist, Your Grace. She was a scientist. A serious one. And she was working on something, a book, a classification, something substantial, that was never completed and never published, and it is sitting in an alcove behind your library shelves." The Duke had not moved during this. He stood on the opposite side of the table and listened with an attention that was absolute and cost him something. She could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw, in the quality of his stillness. "I know," he said. 2 words. Carrying considerably more than 2 words' weight. "Did you read her work?" Alara asked. "Some of it." A pause. Enough to understand that it was significant. "Then why?" she stopped. She had enough information to form several hypotheses, and she was not certain which question to ask first. She chose the one that seemed most immediately important. Why has none of it been published? Even posthumously, even anonymously, if the work exists and it is as good as it appears. "Because she is not dead," he said. The library went very quiet. Alara looked at him. He held her gaze with the expression of a man who has just set down something enormously heavy in a place he is not certain is safe, but has run out of the strength required to carry it any further. "She left," he said, "in October 1811. She left, and I told the world she had died, and that is the shape of it." He pulled out the chair on his side of the table and sat down, heavily, as though the sentence had taken something structural out of him. There are reasons. I will tell you them. But the relevant fact for what you have found is that she is alive. Somewhere. And her work is here. And it has been here since she left it, and I have not known what to do with it. Alara sat down as well. She looked at the specimen cases, the notebooks, the parallel evidence of 2 women working in the same fields in different years, finding the same things from different directions. "She asked you to keep it safe," Alara said quietly. "The letter." "Yes. And you have. For 3 years. His voice was even, but the evenness was effortful. "I am not certain keeping it hidden is the same as keeping it safe. I am not certain she understood what she was asking me to hold." Alara thought about the folder in her traveling case. The collection of rejection letters addressed to a man who did not exist. The years of work produced under a name not fully her own, in fields she loved, for an audience that did not know she was there. She thought about the chalk downlands in spring, the particular quality of light on the escarpment at 6 in the morning, before the dew had dried. The way a root system, properly examined, tells you everything about what the soil has been through. I think, she said slowly, that what she asked you to hold may be more connected to the present than either of us has yet understood. She turned her notebook to face him and pointed to a page near the back, her most recent observations, the ones she had been developing toward a second paper, the work that had been rejected yesterday by a man whose name appeared in a dead woman's journal. "Whitmore," she said. "Tell me what you know about him." The Duke looked at the page. Then he looked at her. And for the first time since she had arrived at Ashford Manor, Alara had the distinct impression that the careful, contained, enormously private man across from her was genuinely grateful that she was in the room. Dr. Ambrose Whitmore was, the Duke explained, the kind of man who had built his reputation on the careful management of other people's ideas. He said it without particular heat, in the measured tone he used for factual statements, but Alara heard the thing beneath the tone, a compressed and long-standing contempt, held at arm's length by the discipline of a man who did not permit himself the indulgence of open anger. Whitmore had been a colleague of the late Duchess, of Isabel, the Duke said, and the name landed in the room with the particular weight of something that had not been spoken aloud in a very long time. Isabel Ashford, née Caldwell. She had been 26 when they married, already several years into serious botanical fieldwork, already producing observations that exceeded in quality anything her contemporaries were publishing. She had been, the Duke said, the most rigorously intelligent person he had ever known, and he said it with the flat honesty of a man describing a geographical feature, not with sentiment, but with accuracy. Whitmore had been part of the small academic circle within which Isabel moved. He had been charming, the Duke said, interested in her work, generous with access to his library and his correspondence networks, both of which she had needed and both of which had carried a cost she had not initially perceived. He was using her, Alara said. It was not a question. He was incorporating her observations into his own published work, the Duke said, without attribution. She identified it in 1810. A paper he presented to the Linnean Society contained 3 pages of analysis that had come directly from her field notebooks. She had shared them with him in good faith, for comment. He paused. She told me about it the evening she discovered it. I suggested she challenge him directly, through the Society's formal process. And she did. And Whitmore denied it. And the Society, composed entirely of men who had professional relationships with Whitmore and none with Isabel, found the complaint without merit. He set his hands flat on the table. After which, he began suggesting, in the quiet way that men in those circles manage such things, that her methodology was unsound. That her work, where it had appeared in print, had benefited from his guidance and ought to be understood in that light. Alara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the rejection letter upstairs. The circuitous, courteous language. The methodology, while not without its merits. Whitmore's name in the correspondence position. He has been doing the same to me, she said. I did not know his name until yesterday, but the pattern, the access granted, the interest, the subsequent rejection framed as methodological inadequacy. I have been experiencing the same pattern for 2 years, through the Society's journal. She looked at the Duke. He did not know Voss was a woman. He could not have. But he apparently makes a habit of finding good work and ensuring it does not prosper independently. Something moved in the Duke's expression. Not the controlled collapse she had seen in the library on the first day. Something quieter and more dangerous, a recognition settling into resolve. Isabel's book, he said. The classification work in the alcove. She had been developing it for 4 years. It was nearly complete when she left. Whitmore did not know of its existence. She had learned, by then, to keep her most significant work away from him entirely. Then it is still original, Alara said. Undiluted. His fingerprints are not on it. No. And the specimens. The field records. They are dated and signed and entirely hers. Yes. Alara sat with this for a moment. The shape of something was forming at the edges of her thinking, not yet fully resolved, but coherent enough to feel the outline of. She set it aside, for now, and returned to the question she had not yet asked. Why did she leave? She said. Carefully. Not as an accusation. As the scientist she was, asking for the data point that would make the rest of the picture cohere. You said there were reasons. The Duke was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she began to think he might not answer, that she had reached the boundary of what he was willing to set down in front of another person. She waited without pressing, because she had learned, in 7 days at Ashford Manor, that this man's silences were not evasions. They were the slow, effortful work of someone deciding how much truth they could afford to give. The marriage was not. It was not a cruelty, he said, finally. I want to be precise about that. There was no unkindness between us, no great conflict. We were two people who had agreed to share a life and had discovered, gradually, that we were not well suited to sharing it with each other. He looked at his hands. I am not an easy person to live alongside. I understand that. I have always required a great deal of solitude. More than a marriage, in the ordinary sense, accommodates well. And Isabel? Alara asked. Required the opposite. A pause. She was not unhappy here, I think, in the early years. She had her work, she had the grounds for field work, she had the library. But a person cannot live on work alone, and I was not present, even when I was present. I did not know how to be. He said it without self-pity, which made it considerably harder to hear than self-pity would have been. By 1810, the situation with Whitmore had made everything worse. She was isolated professionally and she was isolated personally, and the isolation compounded in ways I did not attend to, as I should have. Alara looked at him steadily. There was someone else, he said. A man she had known before her marriage, a naturalist, working in the field rather than the academy. He had been in correspondence with her for years, in the way that colleagues correspond. But by 1811 it had become something that was not collegial. He was precise about this, she noticed, clinical almost, as though the precision protected him from the weight of the content. She told me in September of that year. She told me honestly, which I have not stopped believing was a kind of courage, even if it did not feel like kindness at the time. And the child? Alara said quietly. He looked at her sharply. The letter, she said. She wrote the work must survive, and I cannot ensure that it does if I remain. A woman who is simply leaving a marriage does not write in those terms about work alone. There is something else she was protecting. She paused. And you told the world she was dead. That is not the story of a man managing a scandal. That is the story of a man protecting someone. The sharp look resolved, gradually, into something that was not quite relief, but occupied the same region. The expression of someone who has been understood without having to complete the explanation. The child was due in the spring, he said. If Isabel had left openly, if I had permitted the truth of it to be known, the child's parentage would have become the subject of speculation that no legal or social mechanism could have fully suppressed. Born before a divorce could be finalized, within a marriage, to a woman whose departure was publicly known to have been a flight rather than a death, the child would have spent its life under a question it did not deserve. So you gave them a story instead, Alara said. I gave them a death. Clean, unimpeachable, beyond inquiry. He met her eyes. Isabel is living in Scotland, under her mother's maiden name. The child, a girl, was born in April of 1812. I receive occasional correspondence, through a route sufficiently indirect to be untraceable. They are well. The library was very quiet. Outside, the February wind moved through the grounds with the sound of something old and indifferent. Alara thought about the portrait on the landing, the landscape, the Suffolk coast, gray-green water. Not a portrait of a person at all. Just a painting of the sea, perhaps from a place that mattered, turned to face the wall by a man who could not look at it and could not bring himself to remove it entirely. You have been carrying this alone for 3 years, she said. It was mine to carry. Yes, she said. But that does not mean it was manageable alone. He looked at her with the expression she had never quite been able to name, the one that appeared when she said something he had not anticipated, and the unanticipated thing reached somewhere he had not intended to leave accessible. She was beginning to understand the expression of a man being known, encountering it unexpectedly, in small, repeated doses, like a person relearning something their body had forgotten how to do. "Whitmore," she said after a moment, returning them both to the ground of the practical, because the ground of the emotional was new and uncertain, and she did not wish to press too far in a single conversation. If Isabel's book were to be published, properly published under her name, with the field records as supporting documentation, it would establish the priority of her observations over everything Whitmore has published in the same area. "Yes," the Duke said. "And my paper. The work he has been suppressing through the Society's journal. If it were presented alongside hers, if the connection between our research were made plain, the pattern of what he has been doing becomes visible." She looked at him. Two women, working independently, reaching consistent conclusions. That is not anecdote. That is evidence. "What are you proposing?" he asked. She was not entirely certain yet. The shape at the edges of her thinking was still forming, still finding its edges in the available light. But it was coming clearer, and what was coming clear had the quality of something that had been waiting, in the alcove behind the false panel, in the folder of rejection letters in her traveling case, in the 7 days of small and careful observations she had been making since she arrived in this house. "I am not certain yet," she said honestly, "but I think the work, both of ours, deserves to exist in the world under the right names. And I think the man who has prevented that from happening has done so long enough." The Duke looked at her for a long, considering moment. "My solicitor," he said, "has contacts at the Royal Society. And there are resources available to me, if they are required." "They may be required," Alara said. He nodded once, with the decisive quality she had observed in him, the way he committed to things quietly and completely, without performance. She began to gather the materials from the table, moving with the careful efficiency of someone used to protecting fragile things. As she replaced the specimen cases in the alcove, her hand rested for a moment on the leather cover of Isabel's journal. The work of a serious woman, kept hidden for 3 years, waiting for a moment it did not yet know was coming. She closed the panel gently. When she turned back, the Duke was still at the table, watching her with that expression, the unnamed one. The one that cost him something. "Miss Voss," he said. "Yes." A pause. Brief, but weighted. "Thank you," he said, "for not thinking less of me." Alara considered him across the room, the careful, solitary, enormously burdened man who had turned a painting to face a wall and kept a dead woman's work safe in a hidden alcove for 3 years out of nothing more complicated than the belief that it deserved to survive. "I do not think less of you," she said. "I think considerably more of you than I did a week ago, which was already more than you have probably been led to expect." She left him in the library with the afternoon light coming in low and golden across the reading table, and she did not look back, because if she had looked back, she would have seen him sitting very still, with the expression of a man who has just, without entirely planning to, begun to heal. The threat arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in the ordinary appearance of a social call. Lord Cedric Marvel was not a man Alara had encountered before, but she recognized his type with the immediate precision of someone who had spent years navigating environments where such men set the terms of engagement. He was 43, well-dressed, possessed of the particular confidence that belongs to men who have never been required to earn it, and he arrived at Ashford Manor without invitation, which told her everything she needed to know about how he understood his own position in relation to other people. She was in the conservatory when he came, the plants now replaced, the glass cleaned, the space restored to something approaching its original purpose, green and warm against the February cold outside. Thomas was with her, seated in the cane chair she had installed near the south-facing window specifically to take advantage of what weak winter sunlight was available. His color was better than it had been in Cheapside. The Manor's air, as the Duke had predicted with characteristic practicality, agreed with him considerably more than the city's had. Mrs. Dallow appeared at the conservatory door. "Lord Marvel is in the drawing-room, Miss Voss. He has asked specifically to see you. His Grace is not currently in residence." Alara looked at Mrs. Dallow, then at Thomas, who had looked up from his book with the alert expression of a boy who is 17 and clever and reads situations faster than most adults give him credit for. "Stay here," she told him. She removed her gardening gloves, smoothed her dress, and went to the drawing room. Marvel was standing when she entered, not from courtesy, she thought, but from the tactical preference of a man who likes to be on his feet when delivering difficult content. He had a pleasant smile of the kind that has no connection to what is happening behind it, and he greeted her with the social warmth of a man who wanted something and was not yet ready to say so directly. "Miss Voss," he said, "forgive the intrusion. I had hoped to find the Duke at home." "He is attending to estate matters," Alara said. She did not sit, because he had not sat, and she saw no reason to place herself below him. "I will pass along your card." "Of course." He set his hat on the side table, a presumptuous gesture, the gesture of a man who does not intend to leave quickly. "Though it is possible that you yourself may be able to assist me. I have a matter of some delicacy to discuss, and as it concerns you directly, your presence may be more relevant than the Duke's in any case." Alara looked at him with the level patience she brought to all things she did not yet fully understand. "Then discuss it." His pleasant smile held. "I have recently become acquainted with the correspondence records of the Royal Botanical Correspondence Society," he said. "A fascinating institution. I have a small investment in its publication operations, purely philanthropic, you understand, an interest in the advancement of natural science." He paused with the timing of a man who has rehearsed. "In reviewing the recent submissions, I came across a name that interested me considerably. E. Voss. The connection to your own name, and to your late father's rather distinguished one, seemed worth investigating." Alara said nothing. She kept her expression precisely where it was. "It is a remarkable coincidence," Marvel continued, "that a woman currently residing at Ashford Manor as the Duke's ward should share a name with a botanical correspondent who has been submitting work to scientific societies for the past 4 years. Remarkable, also, that the handwriting on the original manuscripts, I had occasion to examine them, purely in the course of my administrative interest, should so closely resemble that of a woman rather than a man." He tilted his head with the appearance of casual interest. "Would you care to comment on that coincidence, Miss Voss?" "I would not," Alara said. "No." His smile remained. "I suspected not. Well, I should tell you then, in the spirit of transparency, that I intend to raise this matter with several people in my acquaintance. The deception of learned societies by a woman publishing under false pretenses is a matter of some public interest, I think. And the connection to the Duke of Ashford, a man whose reputation is already somewhat, how shall one put it, susceptible, makes the story considerably more compelling to those who follow such things." Alara held her position. She thought with one part of her mind about the specimen cases in the library alcove, about Isabel's journal, about Whitmore's name appearing in a rejection letter and in the margins of a dead woman's books, and about what that connection, properly established, would mean for the man currently standing in the Duke's drawing room with his hat on the side table. "You are friends with Dr. Whitmore," she said. It was not a question. Something shifted in his smile, a fractional adjustment, a recalculation. "We are acquainted. Through the society. Among other contexts. He asked you to come here," she said. "Or, if not directly asked, he provided you with the information and understood how you would use it." Marvel looked at her with a new quality of attention, the reassessment of a man who had arrived expecting a simpler target. "You are perceptive, Miss Voss. I will grant you that." "What is it that you want?" Alara asked. "Specifically." "Specifically," he said, and the pleasantness dropped a register, becoming functional rather than ornamental. "I want the work that is in this house. I am aware, through sources I need not specify, that the late Duchess left materials here that are of considerable scientific value. Materials that, properly attributed and published, would significantly advance the standing of anyone associated with them." He straightened his cuffs. "Whitmore has worked for years in the fields those materials address. He deserves the credit of their publication. And in return for, shall we say, facilitating a quiet resolution to the matter of E. Voss and the question of your correspondence with scientific societies, We are prepared to ensure the entire matter disappears with complete discretion." The drawing room was very quiet. Alara thought about what it must have been like for Isabel to discover the theft of her work and to bring a formal challenge and to be dismissed by a room full of men who had already decided which version of the story they preferred. She thought about 4 years of letters signed with her father's initial and the particular weariness of building a professional life in a structure designed specifically to prevent you from doing so. She thought about the Duke. "I need you to leave this house," she said. Marvel blinked. "Now," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "You will take your hat and you will leave, and you may do whatever you have decided to do. I will not bargain with you, and I will not provide you with anything. Not Isabel Ashford's work, not my own, not a single press specimen or handwritten label." She crossed to the door and opened it with the smooth certainty of a woman who has opened difficult doors before. "Mrs. Dallow will see you out." He recovered his composure quickly. She gave him that. He retrieved his hat with the deliberate pace of a man who will not be seen to retreat, and he paused at the doorway with a last adjustment to his smile. "I had hoped for a more cooperative conversation," he said. "I'm afraid you have made things rather more complicated for the Duke than they needed to be." "The Duke," Alara said, "is considerably more capable of managing complication than you appear to have estimated." Marvel left. Alara stood in the center of the drawing room and breathed carefully until the sound of the carriage on the gravel had faded. Then she went upstairs, sat at the writing desk of her room, and produced 3 letters in rapid succession, one to Lady Gresham, one to Mr. Graves the solicitor, and one that she addressed to a name she had found in Isabel's journal, a fellow naturalist whose correspondence with the Duchess had been warm and substantive, and who had published, under his own name, in venues that Whitmore did not control. She was finishing the 3rd letter when she heard the Duke return. She went to find him. He was in the entrance hall, handing his coat to the footman, and he read something in her face immediately because she had come to understand a precise and particular ability to read her face, which she found simultaneously useful and unnerving. "What has happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. Marvel's visit, the threat, the demand, the specific mention of Isabel's materials, and the presumption that they could be bargained over. She told him without softening any part of it, because he was not a man who benefited from softened information, and because he deserved the full picture. He listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she had come to value about him, the completeness of his attention when she was speaking, the absence of the restless half-listening that characterized most people's reception of difficult news. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him to leave," he said. "Yes." "Without consulting me?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "It was the right decision. I am confident of that. If you disagree, I am willing to discuss it, but I will not apologize for making it." Something moved in his expression, the almost smile, and it appeared at a moment she had not expected it, which made it land with a force she was entirely unprepared for. "I do not disagree," he said. He looked at the 3 letters in her hand. "Who are you writing to?" She told him. When she reached the 3rd name, the naturalist from Isabel's journal, he went still for a moment with the quality of a man recognizing something. "He would help," the Duke said quietly. "He knew her work. He has always known it was significant." "Then we should ask him," Alara said. He looked at the letters, then at her, with the expression she had no name for, the one that cost him something and that appeared more frequently now than it had in the early days, as though the cost were becoming something he was increasingly willing to meet. "Marvel will move quickly," the Duke said. "He and Whitmore will take the story to whatever channels cause the most damage, and they will do it within the week, before we can establish any counterposition." "I know," Alara said. "Which means we have perhaps 4 days." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the steady attention of a man making a decision he has in some sense already made. "Whatever resources are needed," he said. "Mr. Graves, the Royal Society contacts, the estate's correspondence network, all of it is available to you. Use what you require." Alara looked at him steadily. "This will draw considerable attention to the manor." "To you." 2. To the circumstances of Isabel's departure, potentially, if people begin looking closely. I know. The story you have constructed may not survive intact. I know that as well. He held her gaze, without flinching. Some stories are built to protect specific people for specific periods of time. The period for that story has perhaps run its natural course. A pause. Isabel's daughter is 3 years old. Her mother's name on a published work of genuine scientific merit is, I think, a better inheritance than a fiction sustained at the cost of the work itself. Alara thought of the letter in the alcove. The work must survive. All right, she said. She looked down at the 3 letters in her hand. Then she looked back at the Duke, at this man who had stood in a gilded hall and bid on the woman no one wanted, who had kept a secret for 3 years out of decency, who had just offered her everything at his disposal without condition or qualification. Your Grace, she said. We are going to need more paper. The almost expression again, warmer than it had been, reaching further. I will have the library stocked accordingly, he said. And they went, together, to begin the work that needed doing. The 4 days that followed were the most purposeful Alara had ever spent inside a house that was not a laboratory. The library became their operations room. Mr. Graves arrived on Friday morning with 2 assistants and a leather case full of documents, and established himself at one end of the reading table with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that something significant was being constructed and wished to be useful to it. Lady Gresham, who had responded to Alara's letter with a speed that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this kind of summons, arrived on Friday afternoon and installed herself in the armchair nearest the fire with the authority of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the world to catch up with her opinion of it. I knew Whitmore was a thief, she said, upon being given the full picture. She said it with the flat satisfaction of someone whose worst assessments have been confirmed. I said so to my late husband in 1807, and he told me I was being uncharitable. Edward was a good man, but he had a fundamental inability to believe that men of education could be genuinely dishonest. She looked at the specimen cases on the table. Show me the girl's work. Alara showed her. Lady Gresham examined Isabel's specimens and journals with the careful attention of a woman who knew enough natural science to understand what she was looking at. She had, it emerged, been a significant patron of several botanical expeditions in her younger years, and her knowledge was practical rather than ornamental. She turned pages slowly, read annotations, held pressed specimens to the light from the window. Her expression, as she read, moved through several registers and settled on something that looked very much like anger of the quiet, enduring kind. This would have been published in any just world, she said. Without question. Without hesitation. We intend to publish it in this one, Alara said. The old woman looked at her with a sharp approval that was one of the finest things anyone had offered her in recent memory. Good, she said. What do you need from me? What they needed from her turned out to be considerable, and she provided it without flinching. Correspondence sent to 3 separate members of the Royal Society's governing committee, 2 of whom were in her direct social orbit, and 1 of whom, she revealed with the tranquil precision of a woman deploying long-held intelligence, owed her a significant personal debt from an incident in 1799 that she declined to specify, but that was clearly, from her tone, entirely sufficient leverage. The Duke worked alongside Alara through those 4 days with a focused capability she had not anticipated, though she recognized, in retrospect, that she should have. He was methodical, thorough, and possessed of the kind of institutional knowledge that made navigating the architecture of learned societies and their publication committees significantly more tractable than it would have been from the outside. He knew which arguments would land with which individuals, which procedural channels moved fastest, which objections would arise, and how to preempt them. He also, she noticed, never slept enough. She found evidence of this on the 3rd night, a Saturday, past midnight, when she came downstairs because she could not settle and wanted tea and found the library still lit. He was at the reading table with Isabel's journal open before him and his own notes beside it, cross-referencing observations, building the scholarly apparatus that would frame the work for the Royal Society's reviewers. He had his coat off, his cuffs turned back, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who had been somewhere far inside his own thinking and was returning from it. "You should sleep," she said. "Shortly," he said. It was the answer of a man who had been telling himself the same thing for several hours. She made tea at the small spirit stove that had been installed in the library for the duration of the operation, because going to the kitchen at midnight seemed excessive, and brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him. He accepted the cup without comment, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. The absence of unnecessary performance around small domestic gestures, the capacity to simply receive a kindness without turning it into an occasion. They worked in companionable silence for a time, she reviewing the naturalist's response letter he had written by return, with an immediacy that suggested he had been waiting years for precisely this request, and his letter was warm and technically substantive and contained, near the end, a sentence about Isabel's work that Alara had read 3 times and found, each time, difficult to get past without feeling something complicated on behalf of a woman she had never met. Asterisk, she was the finest field botanist of her generation. That this has not been recognized is not a failure of the science. It is a failure of the world the science inhabits. Asterisk. He loved her, Alara said, without intending to say it aloud. The Duke looked up. She met his eyes. The naturalist. In his letter, the way he writes about her work, it is not collegial. It is something else. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I know. Is he, are they? Yes. He looked back at his notes. He is a good man. She is, I believe, content. A pause. That matters to me. Whatever else the situation was, whatever her happiness matters to me. Alara looked at him across the lamplight, at the turned-back cuffs, the ink on his right hand, the shadows under his eyes, the expression of a man who has done a genuinely difficult and decent thing and received no credit for it and asked for none. You loved her, she said, as gently as she had ever said anything. I wanted to, he said, which was, she thought, a more honest answer than most people would have managed and more painful than the simpler one. I was not. I did not know how to be the person she needed. I have not been certain that I know how to be that for anyone. He looked at his hands. It is a difficult admission for a man to make about himself. It is a brave one, Alara said. He looked up at her. Most men, she said, would construct a story in which the fault lay entirely elsewhere. You have not done that. You have looked at it clearly and described it clearly and carried it clearly. That is not a small thing. The library was very still. The fire had burned low without either of them attending to it, and the room had the quality of deep nighttime, compressed, private, existing slightly outside the ordinary rules of daylight conversation. I have been thinking, he said after a moment, with the careful tone of a man navigating new ground, about what happens after this week. After the Royal Society presentation. After Marvel and Whitmore are dealt with and the work is in the world where it belongs. Yes, Alara said. The arrangement was for the season, he said. That is what we agreed. It is. The season ends in June. He looked at the table. At the 2 cups of tea, the paired notebooks, the work that had grown between them over 4 days into something neither of them had named. I find that I do not. I am aware that the terms of the arrangement do not extend beyond June. And I am aware that you have your own work, your own trajectory, your own. Thomas will need continued care, and you will want to pursue the publication of your own research, and there's no reason to assume he stopped. Collected himself. Tried again with the directness he brought to everything else and was, she could see, struggling to bring to this. I do not know how to say this without either overstepping or failing to say it at all. Then say it imperfectly, Alara said. I am not a woman who requires perfect delivery. He looked at her. I do not want June to be the conclusion, he said. Of this. Of you here. I am not certain what that means in practical terms or what it would look like or whether it is something you would have any interest in considering. I recognize that I am not, he paused. I am not easy. I require too much solitude, and I am not fluent in the ordinary language of this kind of thing. But I find that the house is different with you in it. I find that I think more clearly and sleep less well and notice things I had stopped noticing, and that is, it is not uncomfortable. It is the least uncomfortable I have been in 3 years. Alara sat with this for a moment. She thought about the fold of his expression when he had first looked at her across the reading table and understood that she had found the alcove, the conservatory doorway, and his question about what had gone wrong. The dinner table, his voice entirely even, dismantling Lord Hensley with surgical precision over a drainage problem. She thought about what it was to be seen, truly seen, without the performance that most social arrangements required, without the reduction of oneself to what other people found manageable. I think more clearly too, she said. And I sleep less well also, for the record. Something happened in his expression. The unnamed one, moving through its full register, reaching somewhere deeper than she had seen it go before. What does that mean? He asked. Carefully. As though the answer mattered in a way he was not certain he could manage if it went wrong. It means, she said, that I think the question of what comes after June is one we should both be thinking about. Not deciding tonight, because it is past midnight and we have a Royal Society presentation to prepare and marvel to outmaneuver. She closed her notebook. But thinking about. Seriously. He nodded. Once. With the quiet completeness of a man who has just received something he had not allowed himself to believe was available and is choosing to receive it carefully. Seriously, he agreed. They returned to their work. But something in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any of the grand gestures that the occasion might, in a different story, have demanded. Simply and irrevocably, the way things shift when two people stop pretending they are not moving toward each other. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Alara gathered her notebooks and stood to leave. At the door she paused, with her hand on the frame, and looked back at him, still at the table, in the low lamplight, in the room that was the truest part of the house he inhabited. Your Grace, she said. Go to sleep at a reasonable hour. I will consider it, he said. She went upstairs. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. The dark grounds of Ashford Manor beyond the glass, the frost-silvered garden, the old oak at the far edge of the lawn that must have been there for a century at least, enduring through everything the estate had accumulated and lost and slowly, painstakingly recovered. She thought about the morning and the work ahead of them and the week that had rearranged her understanding of what it was possible to find in a place she had entered as a contract. She thought about June. Then she put out the lamp and lay down and found, with a frequency that had been increasing steadily since her arrival and that she was no longer making any particular effort to suppress, that she was looking forward to tomorrow. The presentation to the Royal Society's governing committee took place on a Wednesday morning in a wood-paneled room on the 2nd floor of Somerset House, and Alara wore her best dress, which was not remarkable, and carried Isabel's specimen cases, which were. The Duke sat beside her. He had not asked whether she wanted him there. He had simply appeared at the carriage at the appointed hour, correctly dressed, with the expression of a man who has made a decision and sees no need to announce it. Lady Gresham had arrived before them and was already seated when they entered, positioned with the strategic precision of a woman who understands that geography is argument. The 3 committee members were present, 2 of them visibly uncertain, 1 visibly hostile, all of them clearly unprepared for what was about to be placed before them. Alara set the specimen cases on the table and opened them without preamble. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not perform. She did not soften or qualify or apologize for the space she occupied. She laid the evidence in sequence, Isabel's field records, dated and signed, predating Whitmore's published work by 3 years in several critical areas. Her own paper, its methodology consistent with, and extending from Isabel's earlier observations. The pattern of rejection letters, all routed through Whitmore's editorial influence, all deploying the same language of methodological inadequacy against work that the specimens before them demonstrated was anything but inadequate. The naturalist, whose name was Dr. James Alderton, had submitted a written statement that Mr. Graves read aloud. It was precise, scholarly, and devastating to Whitmore's claims of independent discovery. It was also, in its final paragraph, quietly furious in the restrained way of a man who has been restrained for a very long time. The hostile committee member asked several questions designed to undermine the provenance of Isabel's materials. Alara answered each one with the flat, documented accuracy of someone who had spent 4 days specifically anticipating them. The Duke answered 2 questions about the materials chain of custody with a legal precision that suggested he had also not slept sufficiently the previous night, for reasons that were becoming professionally productive. Lady Gresham said nothing throughout. She did not need to. She simply sat and watched with the expression of a woman whose presence alone reminded every man in the room of debts outstanding and reputations in her keeping. By midday, the committee had agreed to 3 things. First, that Isabel Ashford's botanical classification work would be submitted for formal publication under her name, with Dr. Alderton named as editorial sponsor. Second, that Alara's paper on chalk downland root systems would be reconsidered for inclusion in the Society's spring publication, this time routed through a review process that did not pass through Whitmore's influence. Third, that the Society's relationship with Dr. Whitmore and his editorial activities would be subject to a formal internal inquiry. It was not Alara knew everything. Whitmore would not be destroyed by a single committee meeting. Men of his kind rarely were. But the work was in the light now, attributed correctly, documented thoroughly, beyond the reach of quiet suppression. That was what mattered. That was what Isabel had asked for. The work must survive. It would. They rode back to Ashford Manor in the carriage through a February afternoon that had, almost defiantly, produced actual sunlight, pale and thin, but present, lying across the bare fields in long golden strips that made the frost-stubbled landscape look briefly like something worth painting. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. The silence was not the careful silence of the early days, that mutual, provisional quiet of 2 people who had not yet decided how much to reveal. It was the other kind, the kind that belongs to people who have been through something together and are sitting with the weight of it companionably without needing to perform a reaction. It is done, the Duke said eventually. The first part, Alara said. The inquiry will take time, and Marvel will find other avenues. Yes. He looked out of the window. But the work is placed. Whatever Marvel does now, the attribution exists in the Society's formal record. He cannot touch that. No, Alara agreed. He cannot. Another silence. Comfortable in the way that only particular silences are, the ones earned rather than stumbled into. Isabel will need to be told, he said quietly, through the usual route, that the work will be published, that her name will be on it. She deserves to know, Alara said. And her daughter. He nodded. He was looking at the fields, but she did not think he was seeing them particularly. He was somewhere further away, not unhappily, she thought. More in the manner of a man watching something he has carried for a long time finally come to rest in a place he can leave it. Your paper, he said, turning back. When it is published, under E. Voss or under your own name? Alara considered this. She had thought about it, over the 4 days of preparation, more than she had thought about most things. My own, she said. Alara Voss. If the Society will accept it on those terms. They will, he said, with a certainty that she found, despite everything, extremely useful to hear. She looked at him, properly, fully, with the directness she brought to everything. He was already looking at her. In the pale afternoon light of the carriage, without the formality of the manner around them or the business of the presentation before them, he looked like himself, like the person she had been steadily discovering beneath the containment, the solitude, the careful management of a man who had decided, after enough hurt, that being known was not worth the exposure. He had let her know him anyway, a little at a time in the library and the conservatory over tea at midnight. Without quite deciding to, the way the most significant things happen. June, she said. He held her gaze. June. I should like to stay, she said. If the offer stands. Not as a ward. As something that does not yet have a name, which we could arrive at without rushing, at whatever pace makes sense. She held his gaze steadily. I am not a woman who requires grand gestures or perfect language. I require honesty and solitude in reasonable measure, and access to a very good library. Something moved through his expression. The named thing, the one she had spent weeks learning to read. Full and unhurried, and entirely unguarded. The library, he said quietly, is yours. Whatever else is mine, that too, if you will have it. At whatever pace. Without rushing. The carriage moved through the winter light, carrying them back toward the manor, toward the conservatory's recovered green, toward the portrait now facing the room, toward the specimen cases that would, within the month, carry a woman's true name into the permanent record of the world's knowledge. Alara reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers, not with the tentativeness of a beginning, but with the quiet certainty of two people who have already, without fanfare, arrived. There is a particular cruelty in the way the world names things it does not take the time to understand. A woman who asks precise questions is called difficult. A woman who works in silence is called cold. A woman who walks into a room carrying a book, who annotates contracts in the margins, who gets down on her knees in a dead conservatory and asks what went wrong, she is called plain, unremarkable, unwanted. She is left standing on a platform after everyone else has been chosen, and the world considers the matter settled. The world is frequently wrong. Alara Voss's paper on chalk downland root systems was published in the Royal Society's Spring Journal under her full name in March of 1814. It was received with the kind of attention that good work receives when it is finally allowed to exist without interference, serious, substantive, generating correspondence from researchers across 3 countries. The methodology that Whitmore had called inadequate was described, by 2 of the journal's most respected reviewers, as exemplary. Isabel Ashford's botanical classification work was published the following autumn, under her name, with a dedication to her daughter. Dr. Alderton wrote the introduction. It ran to 4 editions within 2 years and is considered, by those who study such things, one of the foundational texts of 19th-century British field botany. In Scotland, a woman with her mother's rapid handwriting read it for the first time at age 7 and decided, with the certainty that 7-year-olds sometimes possess about their futures, that she would be a scientist. Dr. Whitmore resigned from the Royal Society's editorial committee in April, following the conclusion of the internal inquiry. He retired from public academic life shortly thereafter. Lord Marvel found that the story he had intended to deploy was considerably less interesting to society pages once the Royal Society's formal record had established the truth of Alara's work and moved his attention to other matters. Men of his kind always do. Thomas Voss spent the spring and summer at Ashford Manor, his lungs steadily improving in the clean country air, reading his way through the library with the systematic ambition of a boy who understands that knowledge is the only inheritance worth accumulating. He liked the Duke, which he expressed, because he was 17 and could not quite help himself, by arguing with him about agricultural theory at every available opportunity. The Duke, to Alara's considerable private amusement, engaged with every argument in good faith and won approximately half of them. The portrait on the landing continued to face the room. The conservatory filled, slowly, with living things. The music room was unlocked in April, and Alara discovered that she could play tolerably, and the Duke could listen with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything he genuinely valued. On a morning in late May, in the garden at Ashford Manor, when the first of the season's growth was coming through the ground with the stubborn optimism that spring always brings regardless of what the winter has been, the Duke asked Alara a question that had no margin annotations and required no contract. She answered it with her whole self, directly, unhurriedly, without performance. The man who everyone believed incapable of love had simply needed someone unafraid of his silence. And the woman the world had left standing on the platform, holding her book, waiting, she had never been unwanted. She had simply been waiting to be found by the one person wise enough to look.